It's interesting now, of course, being interested in data and analytics. How have you? Do you think they've been doing a good visualization? Is it easy to follow? Is it good? Could they do it better?
I stumbled on the New York Times page, and they were doing some really impressive visualization, helping you to understand and so forth. But they stand out. And
what did they do?
You could interactively go and explore the swing states and the different counties and so forth with detailed statistics on how each county was doing in the voting and in the counting and in comparison with the previous elections and so forth. And I think they stand out, and you can clearly see that they have become like a data mature company and have got a grip on how to work
present
with
the data,
so forth. If you look at technical conferences, they are frequently there presenting what they're doing, how they're working.
It's really great to see actually a media company that actually knows how to work with data properly, which is rather scarce.
But you commented before, Anders, why don't we see trends?
I'm a data nerd, so I just get annoyed by, why don't they have this obvious kind of visualization they should have, to really, tell what's happening.
The trend.
But I'm damaged from work, I think, for doing that. But one other thing that I really get annoyed with is how poorly the opinion polls are, measuring up.
They are just like the previous election.
Exactly.
But we have to remember that this is a very difficult thing to predict and project because you don't have any reliable measurements anymore. I mean, in the past, when we were responding to these CFO things, they would call everyone, and then you get an unbiased view of the society. Now we don't have fixed phones; we can't reach everyone, so every measurement we do is naturally biased. And then the rules are different in different countries, and people are online in different patterns, and so forth. And it not only differs between countries, but also between the states in the U.S. So the sort of the underlying election algorithms are different. So it's a really difficult challenge to do properly.
Yes.
So, before we leave it, I actually did a Google search today. In the morning now, when it's still not decided, blah, blah, blah. And I typed in AI plus US election. And one of the top hits I get, or one of the topics you get around this is several articles around a quite elaborate Twitter analytics initiative that has been done previous to the election, we're basically using tweets as a way and scraping that as a way to understand sentiment, and from sentiment understanding where will this go. And the interesting point is this model actually predicted a very close race. But they were doing it nicely. That they weren't saying that they had the perfect model. They were very humble, but they were much closer to the reality where the polls were talking about the landslide for Biden.
Maybe that's because they measure how the Russian bots will vote. That's actually.
But it's interesting, because in the article it also highlights the tricky point of doing a model on tweets, because of course the whole model is from the beginning biased. Ultimately, who is on Twitter? And it's a clear difference, but they kind of took that into account, and they compared it and pumped the model up with data from last year. Interesting, I think.
Speaking about using Twitter for trying to understand some kind of sentiment in the society, it moves to Corona as well. And we actually in Peltaren also did a Twitter sentiment analysis or toxicity analysis of Corona, and actually fed that to Riksbanken and have some kind of live understanding of what's happening. And this is actually, I think, an expert topic for you as well, Lars, that I know did some investigation into trying to understand, how to use data quality or data for Corona. What was that about? Can you?
Well, I wanted to do something, right? Yeah. Everybody wanted it back in February. Exactly.
How can I help?
And I've taken on as a life mission to go out and help companies, organizations get the superpowers of data. And that has turned out to be really difficult for companies to get mature in that sense. And usually I just shrug my shoulder and go to the next company. But in terms of Swedish health authorities, there is no startup that we can hope to come and disrupt them, right? They're just the one and only. And we actually did a little effort trying to help with projections and so forth. There was us and then a small data science startup called Model AI. So we had a model with where you could predict how corona spread based on anonymous mobile data and so forth, and try to get the chain and data from the mobile actors onto the out to the regions to plan for the outbreaks and so forth. And we got a lot interest from several regions, but we weren't able to pull the whole chain together, unfortunately. So I thought, what else can we do? So my contribution in the end became this presentation where I used COVID-19 and the response and highlight how much value from data that we're leaving on the table by not handling it properly, and how much more we could do. After that presentation, there was this incident in the UK where they were missing, tens of thousands of tests because they mishandled some data in Excel.
But I think, could you give us a snapshot? Because you actually did a very applauded presentation at Data Innovation Summit this year. And it was quite interesting how you, with quite simple techniques, could basically dissect the data set and how they have used it, and if there was any real, what was the data robustness, so to speak. So please, could you, that was very interesting. So for the ones who didn't hear that one, could you give us the...
So a sort of a couple of highlights. I tried to show how some common mistakes that you make when handling data and mishandle the data quality, and how that leads to wrong conclusions. So one of the focuses of the presentation was if you mishandle code quality and omit the software engineering piece, you end up doing what the Imperial College in London did, where they actually published a source code, which was great until I looked at it and I became terrified. Right, that source code that would never pass an undergraduate course in university. And I looked at the code and I said, there is no chance that this code could produce the right results. Yet the outcome of that code has affected lots of government policies.
And give some technical details.
Now let's go nerdy on this one. Let's really
go nerdy. What kind of code was
it?
What language was it? What they trying to do actually?
This is super interesting.
In theory, it was C++. Syntax-wise, it was C++, but it doesn't look like C++. There were functions that were 800 lines long, and they did not fit on a screen. And you could
lots of tests, of course, full test coverage.
Well, there was actually. One or two tests, and
really?
Yes, that was surprising. But they tested that they were pure regression tests. So they tested that the code produced the same incorrect result as the last time. but they actually didn't work. So they had to disable them because the code was completely indeterministic. So if you changed the number of threads, for example, the outcome result differed by 20%.
So just the number of threads changed the actual data.
If you just change purely technical parameters, and I didn't do these tests, but there's a great code review out there by an ex-Google engineer linking to some experiments that have been done on the code. And the response when they were criticized here was staggering as well, because there were GitHub issues, and someone said that there's this constant number of days in a year, and it's 364. Surely that's not correct, right? This was actually leap year, so this should be 366. But the response was no. In C++ you count from zero, so that's right. And then I looked at the code, and it was that's not correct, right?
Yeah.
And it had all these blatant problems all over the place, and there were Swedish researchers that ran this code on Sweden, because Sweden didn't do the lockdown that the Imperial College were advocating for and so forth. And after the fact, the outcomes in comparison to the model were off by a factor of 20. Right. So
that's outcome in terms of the spread, or what's the outcome in this case?
The number of deceased in Sweden. So
fatalities.
Exactly. So they had predicted about 100,000 fatalities in Sweden by now, given the measures that were taken in Sweden.
It was off by a factor of 20 or something?
By a factor of 20, yes. And they concluded in Britain that well, it's great, the authorities listened to us, and then so we saved hundreds of thousands of lives. So they were celebrating their own incompetence.
But it's so many disturbing points here. But let's break it down. I mean, so one of the key things here is a little bit like let's talk about a profession now. Who do you think made that code? What profile of it? Clearly not a data engineer, but rather a data scientist.
So I mean,
no, that was a cheap shot.
I'll pass on that one.
We have, by the way, one data scientist and one data engineer. I couldn't help it.
We're sitting on different sides of the table. We can throw crisps at each other. No, they were domain experts, right?
Domain experts.
Right, they are epidemiologists, and clearly they had no software engineering expertise in the room. And it's fine. People don't have to be software engineers, but then you take some help, right? Yeah. It's obvious. It's like driving a fleet of ambulances and never taking them to the car mechanic, right? It's obvious that things will go bad, and they did.
You can do some things as a domain expert, but other things you need help with.
Yeah,
and if it's a car, you can drive it, but perhaps you can't fix.
But this is one of the most concrete, very big blow-ups that highlights the need for cross-disciplinary ways of working when you do data ops and data science and all this. Don't try this as home folk on your own. That's my bottom line. I just want to nail that down. That here and here we have the other disturbing fact. Then what happens now? We become data-driven and we start acting upon it, and it's wrong. That's quite disturbing as well.
And that's kind of an example of the opposite arrogance, right?
Yes.
That where when data engineers and data scientists sit on one side and say, we have mastered deep learning, we can tackle any domain, and how hard can it be? Right. Yeah. And we have thousands of failed startups on like that assumption. So I'm utterly convinced that we work best when we combine the technical capabilities with the domain experts and try to be humble and learn from each other and work together.
And then going all the way back to this AI After Work podcast, we need to have the different perspectives working together. And here we need to get the same lingo. We need to understand each other. And we need to start understanding that this is a cross-disciplinary approach.
Yeah, and I think it's a classical thing we have spoken of a number of times, like the catch-22 of you have people knowing the domain and are experts in that, and they don't know the computer science and data science behind it, but they know the domain. And then you have data scientists or data engineers that know data and computer science really well, but don't know the domain. And if they don't collaborate, it will not work well. And you wish you could have both, or better tooling or something to enable, if you can enable domain experts that really, use data and AI properly, then we would have a really nice situation. But we're not really there yet, or?
No, that's a long journey. I think the simple answer is just like working together. And going back to COVID and that presentation, one of the other topics was I looked at what the Swedish authorities are presenting, right? And they don't have this, I know that not everybody likes them, and I'm not saying whether they're doing the right and wrong things here, but they don't have the same arrogance with respect to people pointing out their mistakes. But I follow these presentations that they used to hold them every day, now twice a week. And every day you see them show these curves and they say, oh, here's the last week. And by the way, the last bar is only 3 days. So you can't compare that bar with the other bars. That's not rocket science, right? In analytics. Every time they have to explain the fallacies or the imperfectness of their own displays. And earlier they used to show the number of deceased or the number of intensive care, and it was always dropping at the end. It's like, why is that graph always dropping? Well, it's because of slow data collection. It takes a couple of weeks for the reports of deceased people to come in, and That's fair, right? But then you shouldn't show a graph of all the data that you have where each bar is not comparable to the other bar. You could
Please take out the non-comparable bars.
Exactly.
Maybe.
Or, I mean, there are lots of things you can do. And in the presentation, I go through a bunch of things. I go through how to make the data, how to compare comparable data, or how to make projections. And this is a good highlight of the data mature companies versus the non-data mature companies, because the non-data mature companies, they are still doing these things with like craftsman's tools, like hammers and manual screwdrivers, right? And they might be really good at this. But in a world where the leading companies have industrial processes in place, right? They are outcompeted. Now, if it wasn't authorities, they would go out of business. But now they are authorities, so they're the only ones that we have.
So we let's explore this further down the track. But we now have almost like a custom workshop, like I'm building cars in a custom garage.
Exactly.
Versus this is Stuttgart, right? And we have the BMW's full production line.
And that is a good analogy, because the companies that are best at doing what we call data ops and after that machine learning ops and so forth, that is very influenced by the lean principles of Toyota, right? Cutting waste, discovering problems early, minimizing the lead time and so forth. And I remember when reading this Toyota Way book. That is the book that has mostly affected my career.